Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 3. Yenafam o Chafhan Kemaf Sath. A name and how he came to it. The inside of Jupe's house grew progressively lighter as Jupe went around the interior with a candle, lighting oil lamps that hung on the walls or sat on shelves and tables. The wicks popped as the candle's flame ignited them. When he was finished, Jupe blew out the candle in his hand and cooled the melted wax with a gentle breath, before placing it into a drawer against the wall. The yellow light flickered as the tiny flames danced ever so slowly behind the glass coverings of the lamps. The interior of the house was a spacious, rectangular central room, with a large iron stove against the far wall, opposite the entrance. Near the stove stood a table with benches on either side of it. It was pushed against the wall, leaving only 3 of its sides available. Shelves, chests, and cabinets littered the room. Against the wall opposite the table there was a small enclosed closet with a door that opened outward into the main room. Next to the front door and opposite the stove, the rest of the house was walled off. Another door stood fixed in this wall. The whole place gave off a very compact feeling. Not uncomfortable, but secure. Jupe gestured to the closet with a hand. "That's the spare room. It used to be mine until I added this portion onto the house." He pointed behind him toward the other door. "Anyway, it's bigger than it looks, and you'll get used to it. I'm sure you could sleep out here on the floor if it's too cramped for you." Kel smiled and scratched at the itch on the back of his head. "I'm sure it will be fine. I'm not expecting a palace or anything." Jupe grunted. "I suppose not." He smiled and then turned to the table. On its surface lay 2 small sickles with smooth, short handles and curved blades. A tall scythe leaned against the wall next to the table. Rust dotted the blades of each of the tools. "I set these out this morning." He grabbed a handful of rags from one of the chests that sat on the ground, along with a small jar. "I wish they would learn to clean themselves, but so far they refuse to be taught." He grinned and tossed a rag to Kel. "We'll need to clean the rust off the blades and then sharpen them before tomorrow morning. It shouldn't take that long." Kel picked up one of the sickles and looked it over. His eyes ran up and down the curve of the blade. The scratches indicated years of hard use. The steel was blemished and inexpensive, unfit for anything beyond farm work. The handle felt good in his grip, as though it belonged. The blade seemed to draw him in, whispering something, promising something. A memory stirred. Steel on steel, metal scraping metal, splintering wood, the dull roar of... "Kel?" Jupe's voice echoed in his head, startling him out of the trance-like state that he had sunk into. He blinked, shaking his head in an attempt to clear it. Jupe was holding his shoulder with a firm hand. Kel looked down again at the sickle in his grasp. His knuckles were white from clenching the handle, and his arm was beginning to twitch from the strain. With much effort, Kel forced himself to release the tool, which fell from his grip back onto the table with a loud clatter. "Are you all right?" Jupe asked, concern laced in his tone. "Did you remember something? Did you see something?" Kel held his shaking hand in his other, and massaged its palm with a thumb. The back of his head began to itch, but he suppressed the urge to scratch it, letting it burn beneath his silver hair. "Did you know that was going to happen?" he asked. Jupe tightened his hold on Kel's shoulder for a moment before withdrawing his hand. "No, I did not." He lowered himself onto a bench at the table and looked up at Kel. "I was going to let it continue, though. Figured you were remembering something. When I saw you begin to shake, I decided against it. I apologize if I interrupted the return of a memory." Kel swallowed and nodded his head, massaging his forehead with a hand. "No, it's all right." He followed Jupe's example and took a seat at the table. Jupe's eyes followed his movement. "I have to ask, did you remember anything?" Kel folded his hands together and sighed. "No, but I heard something. It sounded chaotic, like a whirlwind of different sounds all mixed together and compounded. I don't know how else to describe it. I think it was a battle of some sort, but I'm not sure. I didn't see anything. He ran his fingers through his silver hair, pulling it back out of his face. Jupe bobbed his head as he listened. Sounds like a battle to me. He stared at something behind Kel's head, with a glazed expression on his face. Listen, let's make a deal with each other. Kel arched an eyebrow and smiled. What sort of deal? I want you to remember, Kel, I really do, began Jupe, but I need to work my field tomorrow, and I also need your help. He straightened his back and continued. Let's make a deal. You help me with my field, and after it's all finished and done, you can stay here for as long as it takes for you to remember. I'll help you if I can. You're not the first soldier I've met with buried memories. As long as you agree to help me with odd jobs around the farm and wherever, you are free to stay through the winter. I could use your help. You could use mine. He stretched his open hand across the tabletop toward Kel. Sound like a fair trade to you? Kel looked at Jupe's hand in front of him. I don't suppose I would have better luck anywhere else at this point, said Kel, and he took Jupe's hand in his and squeezed it with a firm grip. Fair enough trade for my taste, Jupe. Thank you, really. A broad grin broke on Jupe's face. He released Kel's hand and slapped the tabletop. Good! Then let's get to work. The faster we finish, the sooner we can begin. He removed several odds and ends from the table so that all that remained were the tools, some rags, and a couple files and the jar. Shall we? The work of preparing the tools for working the field went quickly and smoothly. The act of running a file along the edge of metal lulled Kel into a daze. The scraping sound was familiar and comfortable in his ears. Jupe prepared the large scythe while Kel handled the much smaller sickles. When the blades were filed and cleaned, Jupe grabbed the jar and pulled apart the knot that held the cloth over the top. After dipping a small corner of a rag into the jar, Jupe began to buff the scythe's blade with the wetted cloth. A familiar scent drifted to Kel's nose, linseed oil. A memory stirred in Kel's mind, but buried itself as quickly as it had surfaced. Jupe worked on the scythe, covering the blade with a thin coat of oil. Dabbing more oil onto the rag, he continued from the blade to the handle, until he had buffed the entire tool with a protective liquid. He looked up at Kel, who by this time had followed suit, and finished the two sickles. Linseed oil, he said, gesturing to the jar, but judging by the way you used it, you probably already knew that. He smiled and wiped his hands on the remaining clean rag before handing it to Kel, who received it with a nod of thanks. Yes, I used to use it for something. I can't remember what, though. When it dries, it locks into the pores of the wood and protects it from rot. Also makes the wood stronger. Jupe smiled. You're right. I grow my own flax here at the farm, but I don't own the equipment for pressing the seeds for their oil. I bring it into town for that. I have a deal with Martin. He's the blacksmith in town and owns the press. He presses it for me free of cost, and we split the product. He uses it for the tools he makes and then sells the rest to farmers, traders, or whoever has money for it. He keeps the majority of it, but I think that's fair enough. He has more need of it than I do, and I get more than I need. He is also a good friend of mine, and the traders charge an exorbitant amount of marks for their linseed oil. I figure helping him out is the right thing to do. They cleaned up the mess that they had made and laid the tools against the wall. Jupe continued. I am slowly coating the outside of my house with it, but it's taking a terribly long time. I finished coating the slates of my roof, though, which is the important part, I figure. He trailed off and began tidying up the area they had been working in. Kel remained seated at the table, unsure if he should help or not, considering he did not know where anything belonged. As he shuffled about, Jupe collected a folded wool blanket and handed it to Kel, who took the blanket and followed him over to the skinny door on the far side of the room. I can't remember the last bed I slept in. Jupe chuckled as he opened the door into the small bedroom. Well, here you go then. The dresser has some clothes in it that you can use if you want. I'm not sure they'll fit, but they're fair game. Also, I have a sheath for that knife of yours. I'll need to put a little extra stitch into its seams and then oil it. I'll give it to you tomorrow morning before we start work. Kel dropped the blanket onto the bed, causing a small cloud of dust to billow up from the mattress. Well, you don't have to do that. It can wait a day or two. Jupe waved his hand, dismissing Kel's offer. Nonsense. You may need that knife tomorrow for working. You can't have it falling out of your belt every time you bend over. Besides, I'm not turning in for a while just yet. I'll need something to occupy my hands till I unwind enough to sleep. You, however, he poked Kel's chest with a finger, you should get some sleep while you can. You're going to be doing most of the work tomorrow. He turned around and stalked over to a cabinet, fussed with something inside of it. Kel smiled and turned to his room. In contrast to the room at the Knight's Head, this was small, cramped, and dusty. The only furniture was a bed and a dresser, with a small looking glass sitting on its top. There was a window in the wall, above the bed, which was smudged with dirt. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Kel felt safe. He spread the blanket over the dusty bed. It was warm inside the house, and he figured it would be more comfortable without a blanket over him than sleeping on a heap of dust. He tugged off his boots and shoved them under the bed with his heel. Standing up, he pulled off his shirt and began to fold it when the looking glass caught his eye. His reflection startled him. When he had seen himself at the Knight's Head, he had only looked at his face. Nothing had stood out or stirred his memory, but now, without his shirt covering him, his mind began to twitch. His chest was pronounced and firm. His shoulders were broad. His arms were thick and veined. His abdomen rippled with rows of muscle. His entire appearance gave the impression of chiseled marble, smooth and unyielding. Upon his left shoulder and running down his bicep there was a symbol tattooed in black ink, a lotus flower resting upon a downward-facing pentagon. In each of the 5 petals of the lotus there were intricately drawn runes, the meaning of which Kel could not remember. Above the symbol there were 3 black dots forming a triangle. Below the symbol there were 2 strange runes, one beneath the other. The entire tattoo reached no longer than Kel's elbow. A mastery emblem, he whispered to himself, finger tracing the 2 runes beneath it. If his memory served him, which it hadn't of late, mastery runes took 100 years of constant study and practice to acquire. Only elves received them from what he knew, and he had 2. Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. And in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.